There is a reason so many disciplined, hardworking people still struggle with deep belly fat, and it has very little to do with laziness or lack of effort. If you have ever pushed yourself through punishing workouts, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, lungs burning, believing that intensity equals progress, and yet your waistline barely changed, this message is for you. Because visceral fat does not respond to punishment. It responds to biology. And biology does not operate on motivational slogans. It operates on signals. For decades, the dominant narrative in fitness has been simple. The harder you train, the more fat you burn. If you are not exhausted, it didn't work. If you are not sore, you didn't push enough. If you are not gasping, you are wasting your time. But here is what physiology quietly reveals. Visceral fat is not impressed by intensity. It is regulated by safety, insulin stability, mitochondrial efficiency, and nervous system tone. That changes the entire conversation. Visceral fat is not the soft fat you can pinch under your skin. It is metabolically active tissue that wraps around your organs. It behaves almost like a dysfunctional endocrine organ, releasing inflammatory signals, interfering with insulin communication, and directly influencing the liver. When it accumulates, it does not simply sit there as stored calories. It actively participates in a feedback loop of metabolic stress. Insulin resistance increases. Inflammation rises. The liver becomes overloaded, blood sugar becomes unstable, and the body enters a protective mode. Now think about what happens when you add aggressive, high-intensity training to that already stressed system. Cortisol rises. The sympathetic nervous system activates. Blood glucose increases to prepare for emergency energy demand. From the body's perspective, you are not burning fat. You are responding to threat, and when the body senses threat, it protects energy. It does not release deep reserves. This is where most people unknowingly work against themselves. They assume stubborn visceral fat means they must train harder. So, they add more intensity, more intervals, more stress. But biologically, they may be reinforcing the exact environment that tells the body to hold on tighter. What if the solution is not more force, but more precision? There is a specific physiological state where the body shifts from defending energy to optimizing it, a state where fat becomes the preferred fuel, insulin stabilizes, inflammation begins to quiet, and the nervous system remains regulated. That state is commonly referred to as Zone 2. But Zone 2 is often misunderstood. It is not slow walking without intention. It is not laziness disguised as exercise. It is a moderate aerobic intensity where your heart rate rises enough to demand energy, but not so high that it triggers survival alarms. In this zone, you can speak in short sentences, but you are not entirely comfortable. Your breathing deepens, but it remains controlled. There is effort but no panic. That distinction matters more than most people realize, because in that state, a powerful internal shift begins. Your mitochondria, the tiny structures inside your cells responsible for producing energy, increase their activity, but instead of relying primarily on glucose, they begin to prioritize fatty acids. This is not just burning calories. It is retraining energy metabolism. At high intensities, the body chooses glucose because it is fast. It is emergency fuel. But emergency fuel is not sustainable long-term. Zone 2 teaches your body to return to fat as a stable, oxygen-dependent energy source. Over time, this improves fat oxidation capacity. You become more metabolically flexible. You burn fat more efficiently, not only during exercise, but throughout the day. And this is where the real transformation begins, not in exhaustion, but in adaptation. Consider a practical example. Two individuals want to reduce belly fat. The first performs high-intensity interval training 5 days a week, sleeps 6 hours, drinks multiple coffees daily, and constantly feels wired but tired. The second performs steady, Zone 2, training 4 times a week, prioritizes sleep, regulates breathing, and maintains moderate consistency. 3 months later, the first person may have experienced short bursts of weight loss, but also plateaus, fatigue, and persistent abdominal fat. The second person may not have dramatic scale changes at first, but waist circumference decreases steadily, energy stabilizes, and blood markers improve. Why? Because the body does not reward aggression. It rewards intelligent signaling. Zone 2 aligns two critical signals the body deeply cares about: safety and energy demand. Without energy demand, nothing adapts. Without safety, nothing releases. Zone 2 sits precisely at the intersection of those two forces. And that is why it is especially powerful for visceral fat. As insulin sensitivity improves, the pancreas no longer needs to overproduce insulin after meals. As inflammation decreases, visceral fat loses part of its protective function. As the liver regains metabolic flexibility, deep fat stores begin to step back, not because they were attacked, but because they are no longer required. This is the shift most people miss. You do not destroy visceral fat, you make it unnecessary. And that requires a different mindset. Instead of asking, "How hard can I push?" you begin asking, "What signal am I sending?" Because your body is always listening. Every breath, every step, every spike in stress, every moment of recovery, they all communicate something. When you learn to communicate clearly, physiology responds. If you truly want to understand why Zone 2 works, you have to stop thinking about exercise as a muscular event and start seeing it as a neurological and metabolic conversation. Because fat loss is not triggered by movement alone, it is triggered by how the body interprets that movement. Your autonomic nervous system is constantly scanning for safety or threat. It does this beneath your awareness, long before you consciously decide whether something feels stressful. When breathing is shallow, when your heart rate spikes abruptly, when your day is filled with deadlines, notifications, caffeine, and emotional pressure, your sympathetic nervous system dominates. That is the fight or flight response. In that state, your body is not optimizing metabolism, it is preparing for survival. Blood glucose rises, cortisol increases, insulin signaling becomes less efficient, and deep fat stores are protected because energy may be needed at any moment. This is not dysfunction, it is intelligent adaptation. Now consider what happens when someone who is already living in that low-grade stress environment adds repeated high-intensity workouts on top of it. They may feel disciplined, accomplished, even powerful, but biologically the signal remains consistent: urgency, demand, threat. And when urgency dominates, the body does not release deep reserves easily. It preserves them. This is why so many people train hard yet remain metabolically stuck. It is not that effort is missing, it is that regulation is missing. Zone 2 works because it changes the tone of the conversation. When heart rate rises moderately instead of explosively, when breathing deepens rhythmically instead of becoming chaotic, when effort is sustained without triggering panic, the parasympathetic nervous system remains engaged alongside energy demand. This dual signal demand without danger is what allows fat metabolism to operate efficiently. Breathing becomes the most practical indicator of whether you are truly in this zone. In real Zone 2, your inhale is full but not forced. Your exhale naturally lengthens. And you can speak in short phrases without gasping. There is a sense of controlled challenge rather than desperation. The moment breathing becomes erratic or speech becomes fragmented, intensity has crossed a threshold and fuel preference begins to shift. Fat oxidation is oxygen dependent. When oxygen delivery becomes inconsistent because breathing is unstable, the body shifts toward glucose, the faster emergency fuel. This transition can happen subtly, which is why many people believe they are training aerobically while they are actually reinforcing glucose dominance. When breathing remains steady and heart rate climbs smoothly rather than spiking, mitochondria respond differently. They increase their capacity to use oxygen and oxidize fatty acids. Over time, this builds mitochondrial density and efficiency. This is not about burning the most calories in a session. It is about improving the machinery that determines how energy is processed every hour of the day. That improvement directly affects visceral fat because visceral fat thrives in environments of insulin instability and chronic inflammation. When moderate, steady aerobic work enhances insulin sensitivity in working muscles, those muscles absorb glucose more efficiently without excessive insulin release. That reduces the metabolic load placed on the liver. And the liver is central to this discussion because visceral fat sits in close proximity to it and directly influences hepatic metabolism. When insulin levels remain chronically elevated, the liver accumulates fat and becomes less metabolically flexible. When steady aerobic training lowers inflammation markers and improves glucose disposal, the liver regains balance. Lipid processing improves. Fat accumulation slows. The biological need to maintain protective visceral storage decreases. Notice the pattern here. Zone 2 does not aggressively strip fat away. It removes the internal conditions that justified its presence. That is a completely different strategy from attacking calories. Another misconception worth addressing is the idea that this kind of metabolic state requires outdoor walking or large open spaces. The body does not care about scenery. It cares about intensity and regulation. You can achieve Zone 2 on a stationary bike, through controlled step-ups, through rhythmic marching in place, or even through slow, deliberate calisthenics, as long as breathing remains controlled and heart rate stays within that moderate range. The movement itself is secondary. The internal response is primary. If effort feels sustainable for 20 to 40 minutes, if breathing remains deep and stable, if heart rate rises without violent spikes, you are likely within the correct physiological window. Sustainability is not a minor detail, it is the foundation of adaptation. The body adapts to what it can repeat. If training constantly overwhelms recovery capacity, progress stalls. Zone 2 provides a stimulus strong enough to demand energy but gentle enough to allow consistent repetition. And repetition, not intensity, is what reshapes metabolic structure over time. This is why individuals who prioritize steady aerobic conditioning often experience lower resting heart rates, improved autonomic balance, and smoother daily energy patterns. These are not cosmetic improvements. They reflect structural changes in cardiovascular efficiency, mitochondrial function, and nervous system regulation. When you begin to see exercise not as punishment but as signaling, your strategy shifts. Instead of asking how hard you can push, you begin asking how precisely you can regulate. Instead of chasing exhaustion, you monitor breathing. Instead of measuring success by sweat, you measure it by sustainability. And this subtle shift in approach is what allows deep metabolic change to occur. Zone 2 may not look dramatic from the outside, but internally it builds the physiological foundation that makes visceral fat reduction possible and durable. Once you begin to understand Zone 2 as a regulatory signal rather than just a workout intensity, something important shifts in how you view progress, because the real transformation does not happen during the session itself. It happens in the quiet hours afterward, and in the weeks that follow, when your physiology begins to reorganize around stability instead of stress. Most people are conditioned to expect immediate feedback. Heavy sweating feels productive. Soreness feels validating. Rapid weight changes feel encouraging. But metabolic repair rarely announces itself dramatically. In fact, the earliest signs of progress often feel almost invisible. You may simply notice that your afternoon energy is steadier, that your cravings are less urgent, that you can go longer between meals without irritability. These are not small changes. They are signals that insulin regulation is improving and that your body is becoming more metabolically flexible. Metabolic flexibility is one of the most underestimated components of fat loss. It describes the body's ability to switch between glucose and fat as fuel without stress. When flexibility is low, small drops in blood sugar feel threatening. The brain demands quick carbohydrates. Cortisol rises. Insulin spikes. And visceral fat thrives in that environment of hormonal turbulence. But when flexibility improves through consistent Zone 2 training, Your body becomes calmer in the face of fluctuating energy demands. It no longer reacts dramatically to minor changes in glucose. It uses stored fat more comfortably. And that comfort changes the hormonal landscape that once supported visceral fat retention. At the same time, mitochondrial adaptations deepen. With repeated moderate aerobic demand, mitochondria not only become more efficient, they become more numerous. This increase in mitochondrial density enhances the capacity for oxygen utilization, which directly supports sustained fat oxidation. Energy production becomes smoother and more reliable. Instead of relying heavily on stimulants like caffeine to compensate for unstable energy, the body begins generating consistent energy internally. The daily rhythm of fatigue and recovery becomes less extreme. You wake up clearer. You recover faster. You feel less dependent on sugar for mental focus. These changes are structural. They are not temporary calorie deficits. They are improvements in how the engine itself functions. And when the engine becomes efficient, fat storage patterns change as a consequence rather than as a forced outcome. Inflammation is another crucial layer in this process. Chronic low-grade inflammation is closely associated with visceral fat accumulation. It is not merely a side effect. It is part of the feedback loop that maintains deep abdominal fat. Steady aerobic training has been repeatedly shown to reduce inflammatory markers over time. As inflammation decreases, the biochemical environment that supports visceral fat becomes less favorable. This does not happen overnight. It happens gradually, quietly, through repeated exposure to moderate oxygen-supported movement. The liver plays a central role here as well. Visceral fat and hepatic metabolism are deeply interconnected. When insulin levels remain chronically elevated, the liver increases fat synthesis and storage. When zone 2 improves insulin sensitivity and reduces inflammatory stress, the liver regains metabolic flexibility. Lipid processing becomes more efficient. Blood glucose regulation improves. And the biological justification for maintaining large visceral reserves weakens. This is why scale weight can be misleading during the early phases of Zone 2 training. The scale measures total mass, not metabolic quality. You may gain slight muscle mass while losing visceral fat. You may retain water differently as inflammation decreases. What changes first is often internal improved insulin signaling, reduced hepatic stress, enhanced mitochondrial function. Waist circumference is frequently a more accurate reflection of visceral fat reduction than body weight alone. There is also a cardiovascular dimension that deserves attention. As aerobic efficiency improves, stroke volume increases, meaning the heart pumps more blood per beat. Over time, resting heart rate decreases. This is not merely a fitness badge. It reflects improved autonomic balance. A lower resting heart rate often indicates stronger parasympathetic tone and better stress resilience. When the nervous system becomes more adaptable, metabolic processes become more stable. One of the most powerful outcomes of sustained Zone 2 training is not just physical change, but emotional stability. When your nervous system is less reactive, your relationship with hunger, fatigue, and stress shifts. You are less likely to use food as immediate emotional regulation. You recover more quickly from stressful events. This resilience feeds back into metabolic health because stress hormones influence insulin and fat storage patterns. In other words, the psychological and physiological benefits are intertwined. What makes Zone 2 transformative is not that it burns the most calories in a session. It is that it builds a foundation that allows every other metabolic strategy, nutrition, fasting, resistance training, to work more effectively. Without aerobic conditioning and mitochondrial health, many interventions feel like constant uphill battles. With a stable aerobic base, the body responds more cooperatively, and perhaps most importantly, Zone 2 is sustainable. It does not exhaust the joints. It does not demand maximal effort every day. It can be repeated consistently without overwhelming recovery systems. Adaptation depends on repetition, and repetition depends on sustainability. Intensity has a role, but only when built upon a stable metabolic foundation. Without that foundation, Intensity becomes another stressor layered onto an already burdened system. The deeper message here is simple but profound. Your body adapts to what you repeatedly signal. If you repeatedly signal emergency, it becomes protective. If you repeatedly signal controlled demand within safety, it becomes efficient. Visceral fat does not persist because your body is stubborn. It persists because your internal environment has justified its presence. Change the environment, and the physiology follows. At this point, you can begin to see why the phrase burning visceral fat is slightly misleading. Visceral fat is not a passive fuel tank waiting to be drained. It is metabolically active tissue. It secretes inflammatory cytokines. It interacts with insulin signaling. It influences appetite regulation and even vascular tone. When visceral fat accumulates, it changes the hormonal environment in a way that further reinforces its own presence. This is why simply attempting to starve it through aggressive dieting or exhausting it through intense exercise often fails long-term. The body senses instability and compensates. Zone 2 training disrupts that loop, not by attacking the fat directly, but by changing the upstream signals. One of the most powerful of those signals is mitochondrial biogenesis. When you consistently expose your muscles to moderate oxygen-supported effort, a transcriptional cascade begins inside cells. Proteins such as PGC-1-alpha become activated. These signals encourage the creation of new mitochondria and enhance the efficiency of existing ones. Over time, your skeletal muscle becomes better equipped to oxidize fatty acids even at rest. This is not a short-term effect tied only to the workout session. It is a remodeling of your energy infrastructure. When mitochondrial capacity increases, something subtle but transformative occurs. Your baseline fat oxidation rises. That means you are burning a higher proportion of fat not just during movement, but during daily living. Sitting, standing, working, walking around your home, the metabolic machinery underneath those activities becomes more fat efficient. This shift is especially important for visceral fat because visceral adipose tissue is sensitive to systemic hormonal tone. When insulin sensitivity improves and inflammatory signals decrease, lipolysis within visceral fat becomes more permissive. The body no longer clings to those stores as tightly. There is also a respiratory dimension that often goes overlooked. Zone 2 improves ventilatory efficiency. Over time, your breathing becomes deeper and more coordinated with movement. Carbon dioxide tolerance increases. Oxygen delivery becomes smoother. These changes influence acid-base balance, autonomic tone, and vascular responsiveness. The circulatory system becomes more adaptable. Blood vessels dilate more effectively. Microcirculation improves. This matters because fat metabolism is not just about fuel availability. It is about delivery and clearance. Efficient circulation enhances the transport of fatty acids to working tissues and improves the removal of metabolic byproducts. In other words, the entire system becomes more fluid. Another physiological shift emerges in the endocrine response. Repeated moderate aerobic sessions help normalize cortisol rhythms. Instead of chronically elevated levels that flatten the diurnal curve, cortisol begins to peak more appropriately in the morning and decline toward evening. Stable cortisol patterns support better sleep, and sleep further reinforces insulin sensitivity and appetite regulation. You can see how the loop becomes virtuous rather than vicious. Each regulated system supports the next. Many people ask how long it takes to see meaningful changes. The honest answer is that visceral fat reduction through physiological remodeling is gradual but steady. Early improvements in insulin sensitivity can occur within weeks. Reductions in inflammatory markers often follow consistent aerobic training over several months. Changes in waist circumference may begin subtly before they become visually obvious. What matters most is consistency. 2 or 3 moderate sessions per week may initiate adaptation, but 4 to 5 sessions create momentum. Duration matters as well. 20 to 40 minutes per session tends to provide sufficient stimulus without overwhelming recovery systems. It is important to clarify that Zone 2 is not a replacement for all other forms of exercise. Resistance training remains essential for preserving muscle mass, improving glucose disposal, and supporting bone density. Higher intensity intervals have their place for cardiovascular performance and time efficiency. However, without a strong aerobic base, these modalities can become stress amplifiers rather than metabolic enhancers. Think of Zone 2 as the soil in which other strategies take root. When the soil is fertile, meaning mitochondrial density is high, autonomic balance is stable, and insulin sensitivity is strong, other interventions yield more predictable results. You may also notice psychological shifts over time. As aerobic efficiency improves, the perception of effort changes. Activities that once felt draining become manageable. Confidence increases not because you are pushing harder, but because your system feels more capable. This subjective experience reinforces adherence, and adherence is perhaps the most underrated variable in long-term health outcomes. The most scientifically perfect protocol fails if it cannot be sustained. Another often overlooked element is the role of skeletal muscle as an endocrine organ. Contracting muscle releases myokines that influence inflammation, insulin sensitivity, and even brain function. Moderate, sustained contractions, characteristic of Zone 2, stimulate these signaling molecules without triggering excessive stress responses. This creates a communication network between muscle, liver, adipose tissue, and brain. The body becomes more integrated. Metabolic health is not isolated to one organ. It is systemic. When you zoom out and view the full picture, the narrative changes. The goal is not to punish fat away. It is to recalibrate the system that once required it. Visceral fat accumulated under conditions of stress, instability, and hormonal dysregulation. Zone 2 introduces stability, oxygen-supported demand, and rhythmic signaling. The body adapts accordingly. Perhaps the most empowering realization is that none of this requires perfection. It requires repetition. You do not need flawless sessions. You need consistent signals. Even small improvements in aerobic conditioning compound over time. Each session slightly improves mitochondrial efficiency, slightly refines insulin sensitivity, slightly reduces inflammatory burden. Those small increments accumulate, and that accumulation is what ultimately transforms the internal landscape. When your internal landscape shifts from reactive to regulated, visceral fat no longer has the same metabolic justification. It diminishes not because you forced it to disappear, but because your physiology evolved beyond needing it. That is the deeper principle behind Zone 2. It is not about intensity. It is about alignment. Alignment between oxygen and demand, between stress and recovery, between movement and safety. When those align, the body becomes metabolically coherent. And coherence is the opposite of chronic fat retention. If you take only one idea from everything we have explored, let it be this. Your body is not resisting you. It is responding to you. Visceral fat is not a personal failure. It is a physiological adaptation to repeated signals of instability. Chronic stress, irregular sleep, erratic energy intake, aggressive training layered on top of an already overloaded nervous system, these are the inputs, and your body, incredibly intelligent and protective, adjusts accordingly. Zone 2 works not because it is extreme, but because it is coherent. It aligns oxygen delivery with energy demand. It aligns effort with safety. It aligns stress with recovery. When those elements come into balance, metabolism stabilizes. Insulin signaling improves. Inflammation softens. Mitochondria expand their capacity. The liver regains flexibility. The nervous system shifts from reactive to regulated. And when regulation becomes the baseline, visceral fat quietly loses its biological purpose. There is something powerful about realizing that the solution is not more force. It is better signaling. Not more punishment. More precision. Not more exhaustion. More consistency. You do not need to destroy your body to change it. You need to teach it. Teach it that movement can coexist with safety. Teach it that energy demand does not equal emergency. Teach it that oxygen-supported effort can be sustained without threat. When that lesson is repeated week after week, your physiology reorganizes itself. This is not a hack. It is not a shortcut. It is not dramatic. It is foundational. And foundations are what determine durability. You may not notice massive changes in a single week, but over months, your energy becomes steadier. Your recovery improves. Your waistline shifts subtly. Your resting heart rate declines. Your sleep deepens. Your cravings soften. And you begin to feel something that no scale can measure: metabolic confidence. Confidence that your body is cooperating rather than fighting you. That cooperation is the real transformation. Zone 2 is not about doing less. It is about doing what aligns with how human physiology actually works. It respects the nervous system. It respects oxygen biology. It respects recovery. And in doing so, it unlocks changes that force never could. Visceral fat does not disappear because you attacked it. It recedes because your internal environment evolved beyond needing it. That is the difference between temporary change and structural change. And structural change is what lasts. So if you move forward with anything, move forward with consistency, move forward with breath awareness, move forward with patience strong enough to allow biology to adapt. Because when you send the right signal repeatedly, your body listens. It always has.